spending hours in DaVinci Resolve trying to recreate the film look? You're not alone. Achieving that classic cinematic feel involves countless nodes and complex color grading workflow. Color space transforms, balance and exposure corrections, effects, LUTs. Sometimes it's just too much. Dehancer is here to the rescue. Dehancer is a powerful DaVinci Resolve plugin that offers professional film emulation, allowing you to achieve the most realistic film look possible with a single node. With this plugin, you can achieve pro-level color grade results without the time-consuming hassle. Dehancer comes with exquisitely crafted film emulation presets to match specific film used to shoot and print the video. By using those presets, you can achieve a captivating and realistic look in just a few clicks. And if you want to dive deeper into personalizing the look, Dehancer is incredibly customizable, giving you complete control over literally every setting. In this video, I'll guide you through the Dehancer DaVinci Resolve plugin, explain all its features, and walk you through optimal one-node cinematic color grade workflow. We'll also explore the Dehancer mobile app for iOS. Feel free to use the chapters below, and should you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Setting up Dehancer is a breeze. Simply follow the installation guide. After installation is finished, head to DaVinci Color page, and here in the Effects tab, scroll to Dehancer. Apply Dehancer plugin to the node, and in the Inspector tab on the right, we can now access all plugin settings. Prior to usage, down in the options, enter your license details. When the plugin is activated, click Check Profiles button to update plugin's resources. Now is a good time to mention two things. First, Dehancer, like most great things out there, is a paid plugin. It is definitely on the pricier side, but it does come with a free trial. Plus, using the promo code NIKBorodenko will save you 10%. And the second thing, this video is not sponsored by Dehancer, though they did reach out and offered me the chance to try out the plugin and mobile app along with participating in their affiliate program. As a small creator, I'm really grateful to Dehancer team for doing that. However, they have no control over what I say in this video. Okay, back to Dehancer workflow. First, let's make things less overwhelming. To collapse all these open menus, while holding Option or Alt on Windows, click one, and it will collapse all of them. So now we have quick access to all of the plugin's settings. Standard color grading workflow in DaVinci Resolve consists of three big chunks. We start with color correction first. That involves adjusting the color space, white balance, exposure, contrast, and saturation. Next, we proceed with the grade itself and finish it off with a bunch of effects like film grain, bloom, vignette, and so on. Dehancer plugin layout is somewhat following that process. Working on color correcting the input first, proceeding with the color grade, and finishing it off with different effects. So we can basically move from top to bottom, adjusting settings in each menu. However, I will propose some variations along the way. First variation is to navigate to monitor. Dehancer comes with clipping indication and false color monitoring options, making it easier to check if your video is properly exposed. False color visualization displays luminance levels by assigning distinct colors to different brightness intensities. Clipping indication highlights areas where information is lost, blue for shadows and red for highlights. By the way, one minor inconvenience here is that after you applied Dehancer Pro to a node, it already has some settings enabled by default. We can fix that by going back to the options and clicking Disable All Tools. And now we can start our color grading from scratch. Moving back to the input. This is basically an inbuilt color space transform within the plugin. However, Dehancer camera profiles are custom made to deliver a more visually appealing result compared to the standard profiles available in DaVinci Resolve. For this feature to work correctly, proper project settings are required. In the bottom right corner, press on the cog icon, and in Color Management tab, set color science to DaVinci Y RGB, and timeline color space to Rec 709. Rec 709 Gamma 2.2 is a common standard for most monitors, while Gamma 2.4 is a standard for broadcast. However, I would recommend sticking to Rec 709A if you or your clients will be watching the video on an Apple device. Also, if you're on a Mac, it makes sense to go to DaVinci Resolve, Preferences, General, and here check Use Mac Display Color Profiles for viewers and automatically tag Rec 709 Scene Clips as Rec 709A. This way you will get the exact same gamma in the exported video as you see while editing. After changing these settings, click Save. Okay, here I have log footage from Pocket Cinema camera, so I select Choose Camera as a source. Next I select Blackmagic Design as a vendor. Then I choose Pocket Cinema Camera 6K and Film Gen 5 ISO 3200. The clip is a bit overexposed, so I will lower the exposure using this slider. I will then adjust the white balance with the temperature compensation slider. And remove a bit of green tint by sliding the tint control to the right. Basically, these do the same as primaries controls in color wheels, and for more flexibility you might want to use those in separate nodes, but for the sake of this video I'll stick to using only the Dehancer controls in one node. Last couple sliders here belong to differential functionality that helps counter chromatic aberrations like this, but we have none here, so we'll leave that off. The only thing missing here is the contrast adjustment, but we can easily use a DaVinci Resolve control in primaries, or the one from Dehancer, which is located in the Film Developer menu. First we have to click this Enable checkbox, and then adjust the contrast. Film profiles are the essence of Dehancer. Dehancer team did an exceptional work of accurately sampling those with all of their characteristics. Important note, all these presets are designed for footage with neutral white balance, which is why it is extremely important to adjust that beforehand. One major inconvenience here. There's more than 60 film presets and no fast way of previewing them like we have with LUTs, for example. I will quickly put up brief info on each film preset on screen so you can pause and read. And for which one you should pick, that is purely up to you. Some film stocks have numbers in names that basically indicate light sensitivity similar to digital cameras ISO. The lower the number, the better the film is for bright environment. Ones that end with D are optimized for daylight shots, and ones with T are optimized for tungsten lights. However, as we are talking about digital footage, these labels are primarily there to indicate the general color characteristics you can expect from that particular film stock emulation. Most tutorials suggest Codec Vision or Portra, and those are great choices. I would also point your attention to options like Codec Gold 200, the emulation of Codec's consumer film line, both films from CineStill if you're after subtle analog look, Agfa Portrait XPS 160, great for light skin tones, and Svima Type 42, that is perfect for contrasty Soviet-style retro looks. Push and Pull EV. This tool is based on real film samples with different exposures. All films behave differently depending on how much light they receive during exposure, so for each film profile selected, the changes in color, contrast and brightness would be unique. For this shot, I will be using Fuji Eterna Vivid 500 and adjust push-pull just a little bit. Maybe a little bit more. Not that much. Next, I proceed to print. Even though printing is the final stage in analog production, in my Dehancer workflow I proceed directly to print at this point. Choosing a profile here significantly impacts the overall look, and I prefer to see that change before fine-tuning smaller details in Film Developer, Compression and Expand. Linear profile doesn't actually introduce any changes, but it allows using the sliders below. Cineon Film Log is a specific format to emulate negative film being scanned in Cineon Scanner. I assume it's used if you intend to print out the footage onto the physical print film. Other three options have their own distinct looks. I generally prefer codec glossy paper in most situations and codec 2383 when I'm after a more contrast look. For this clip, I'll stick with trusty glossy paper. Let's talk about these settings and then I'll adjust them for the clip I have. Target white. Adjust the color temperature of the printing light between 5500K and 6500K, affecting the white balance. This works only with print film profiles. Exposure. This is a simulation of how long the film is exposed to light during printing. Unlike exposure controls in the input section, adjusting this affects both brightness and contrast, similar to the effects seen with actual film. Tonal contrast. This is a non-linear contrast adjustment. When you increase it, the image becomes punchier with stronger contrasts between dark and light areas. When you decrease it, the image softens and appears flatter. It also slightly changes the overall brightness to mimic the traditional film. Color density. This is basically like a smart saturation. It boosts or reduces colors that look important to human eyes, making them more vivid or muted, while leaving less important colors alone. This tool is good for making key colors pop. Saturation. A basic saturation control, but only one way down. It makes all colors less intense. But it is a bit more complex under the hood than regular DaVinci Resolve saturation control, as it alters the chroma components in YCRCB space, which means that Dehancer handles color and brightness separately. Because of this, Dehancer saturation reduction looks more natural and film-like. So when you lower the saturation in Dehancer, you are just turning down the color, not the brightness. This keeps all the details and makes the image look less flat, compared to just turning down the saturation in Resolve, which can make things look washed out. Analog range limiter. Switching this on prevents the clip from having pure white or pure black areas, mimicking how print film handles extreme brightness levels. Instead of clipping to solid white or black, it preserves some details in the brightest and darkest parts of the image, giving it a softer, more film-like look. I almost always have this setting turned on. Then I'll proceed with adjusting the contrast and exposure. I leave color density untouched for now and proceed to Film Developer section. Here we've already touched the contrast boost. It can either increase or decrease the contrast. It seems to work a bit more subtle compared to standard DaVinci contrast tool. Gamma correction. Basically a twin brother of pivot setting from color wheels. This parameter determines how much the midtones are shifted towards shadows or highlights. Works only when contrast's boost value is other than 0. Color separation. This setting controls how vivid the most intense colors are. Lower values reduce the saturation of the brightest colors first, while leaving less intense colors mostly unchanged. Nice tool. Very subtle. Closest alternative I can think of in DaVinci Resolve is saturation versus saturation curve, which is less convenient. Color boost. Unlike color separation, adjusts the overall saturation of the image, making all colors more vivid or less vivid. While the name is identical to an inbuilt DaVinci Resolve setting, this type of color enhancement is more gentle and does not lead to color clipping. If I adjust this contrast boost parameter when I'm working on the input, I try not to touch it much again, using the tonal contrasts from print instead. But still, in this situation, I can push down gamma correction just a bit. And I don't touch color boost yet. Instead, I go to film compression. Film handles bright lights differently than digital cameras, with a smoother, more gradual transition to white. This tool simulates that effect and mostly affects the highlights. Impact. determines how strongly the highlights are compressed. Higher values mean a more noticeable effect, pushing bright areas closer to medium brightness. White point sets the starting points for where the compression begins. Lowering the white point increases contrast in the highlights. Raising the white point decreases contrast, making highlights look flatter. Tonal range controls how much of the image is affected, where 0 means no effect and 100 means the effect is applied to a very wide range from the brightest highlights almost to the darkest shadows. A lower value will affect just the brighter areas of the image. Keeping this closer to default setting often is the most optimal option. Color density. After we've compressed highlights, this tool controls how colorful those highlights remain. That's why this color density setting effect is dependent on other film compression settings, mostly on tonal range and impact. The more colored highlights we compressed, the larger range this tool will have. Main difference between these two identically named color density settings here in film compression and in print menu we talked about previously is in effect range. The print setting affects the entire image color saturation, and the film compression setting specifically affects the color saturation in the compressed highlights. I usually start with pushing impact to 100, especially if it's the bright shot like this one. After that, I check if I can lower down the white point, because pushing it harder makes the image too flat. Next, I adjust the area of effect by dragging the tonal range. I can probably go all the way up here as the sky is too bright. However, I don't want to lose the contrast on the man's face, so I will leave tonal range pretty close to the default setting. And now is finally the time to adjust the colors. As there are two controls for density in Dehancer, plus color boost slider will use a combination of those three. I usually start with cranking up color density all the way up in the print section. After that, depending on the scene, I either decrease or increase color density in film compression. If, like in this example, we have a very bright sky, I increase this color density, saturating the blues in the highlights. If there's still not enough color, I add some with a color boost slider and readjust color densities if necessary. Most of the times I tend to keep the colors as dense as possible. That's why, should I need to make the overall look more subtle, I will still keep the color density high and decrease saturation in print section instead. Expand. The Expand tool provides a manual control over the absolute darkest black point and brightest white point parts of the image. Color mode. Aside from two sliders for black point and white point, we have the color mode toggle. In the Luma mode, Expand affects only the brightness component of the image, but does not affect its saturation. This is useful if you want to adjust contrast without changing the colors, or if you are seeing unwanted color changes. By this point, your footage should already be close to the desired result in terms of how shadows and highlights look, but if some tweaks are still needed, Expand is a handy tool for that. However, it is rather aggressive and can easily lead to clipping, so should be used accurately. And it makes sense to have the clipping monitor turned on. It can be found in Monitor tab right here. Even though we have film compression and analog range limiter turned on, dragging these black point and white point sliders can easily lead to clipping both in highlights and shadows. So I'll introduce a rather subtle change. Moving on to color head. This tool lets you adjust the overall color balance by adding or subtracting amounts of cyan, magenta, and yellow in three complementary CMY RGB pairs. It simulates the color controls found on traditional photo enlargers and movie film printers. Basically a more film-like and easier to use version of DaVinci Resolve color wheels. Aside from sliders, we have a checkbox called Gang. This checkbox lets you adjust all three colors together, which is useful for making overall color temperature shifts from magenta to green, somewhat similar to DaVinci Resolve tint control, but less destructive. Using controls below Gang checkbox, you can add different color tints to the shadows, midtones, and highlights separately. It simulates a traditional film printing technique where different colored filters are used to tint different parts of the image. Here I probably would like to push the image into magenta a bit more, and to add more color contrast to the image, I would add some warmth to shadows and push highlights into blue. Preserve exposure. When set to 100, Dehancer automatically adjusts the brightness to compensate for any color changes you make, keeping the overall exposure consistent. 0 means no compensation, just like in real analog printing. This can be useful for creative effect, but I prefer to always keep this at 100. Impact adjusts the overall strength of the effect. But as all the controls here are really precise, I usually don't use the impact slider as well. Perfect. Now we only have a bunch of effects to add on top of our color grade to make it look even more like film. Every effect has presets based on film format, ranging from Super 8 to 70mm. Plus has a custom option where you can tweak all the parameters. I won't go over those in detail to keep this video from becoming extremely long, but if you would like to see a detailed tutorial on that, please let me know in the comments. Film grain. Dehancer's film grain isn't just a simple overlay. Instead, Dehancer plugin reconstructs the shot using information about the color and brightness of each area, and then it applies a complex simulation of how real film grain forms. The result is grain that looks and behaves much more authentically because it's integrated into the image itself, not just layered on top. Each grain profile has 3 ISO versions. The higher the ISO, the more prominent the noise is. Plus we have a control over amount of grain generated. For this clip, I will stick to a rather subtle grain at 65mm and ISO of 250. Halation. Halation is a real film effect that creates reddish, orange glows or halos around bright lights, reflections and strong edges. It can also sometimes add a reddish tint to the midtones, especially skin tones, and make them look really cinematic. Each halation profile has 2 versions. Standard, which simulates film with a special layer called ramjet that reduces halation, and no ramjet version without that layer. Additionally, effect strengths can be customized with the Amplify slider. I really like how halation looks. It adds a lot of style to the image, in my opinion, so I usually pick either 8mm or 8mm no ramjet, but usually this much halation is probably too much, so I adjust the halation with the Amplify slider by lowering it down. So sticking to no ramjet halation with Amplify value of 32 is a bit more than using a halation with ramjet at a default Amplify value. Bloom. This simulates the way light spreads and glows around bright areas in a photo or video if it was captured with a real film. While it is not the same as just blurring the image, it still introduces some blur, and it intersects with halation in some areas. Bloom specifically happens around bright light sources and where very bright and dark areas meet, making the light look softer and more diffused. And if we push halation and bloom very high, it makes the image way too soft, which would probably be good for the dreamy look. But for this clip, I will stick to rather subtle bloom with a default preset of 65mm and a standard default Amplify setting. Film damage. Film damage simulates the imperfections that often appear on real film, like dust, hairs, scratches, and stains. Total amount slider controls the overall amount of damage, dust, scratches, etc. that is added. Amount jitter introduces random variations in the total amount of the film damage effect. I usually stick to 35mm preset and switch the amount jitter on to make it look even more realistic. Film breath. Film breath simulates the slight random changes in brightness, contrast and color that can happen from one frame to the next when shooting on real film. These variations are caused by things like uneven film coating, tiny differences in how each frame is developed, or even slight changes in the camera's shutter speed. Film breath adds these imperfections to digital video, making it feel more analog. If I'm using it, I'm sticking to either 65mm or 35mm preset to make it rather subtle. Gate weave. Gate weave simulates the tiny, natural movements of film as it's pulled through a camera or a projector. Real film isn't perfectly steady, it jiggles and shifts slightly. Gate weave adds this subtle jitter and automatically zooms in on the clip. I generally skip this effect, aside from the situations where I need to simulate a very old black and white film. Overscan. When film is scanned, they often capture a bit more than just the picture itself. This setting adds extra area that can include things like the space between frames, the perforations, and even bits of the frames before and after. Normally, this extra stuff is cropped out, but sometimes this can be intentionally left for stylistic purposes. Once again, I don't use that too often. One suggestion if you decide to switch Overscan on is to uncheck static gate. That would add some imperfections to the gate's edges, making this effect look even more realistic. And the last effect we have here is Vignette. Vignetting is often seen as an imperfection in lenses, making the edges of the photo darker than the center. It can be used intentionally here in Dehancer to draw attention to the center of the image. Additionally, you can use a vignette to lighten the edges if you want to fix the unwanted darkening that was caused by a real lens. Adding vignette in Dehancer is easy. Just toggle the enable, and to see it better, go into the mask mode. Here we can adjust the size and parameters. I would probably make it smaller. You can also move the center of the vignette, but I will keep it perfectly centered here. I will uncheck the mask mode to see how it changes the image. Decrease the exposure to the maximum. Lower down the feather. First, I adjust the feather to understand the area vignette is affecting, and finally I bring back the exposure, making this effect very subtle. And finally we have the output menu. This slider controls the overall strength of all the Dehancer effects you have turned on. It's like a master volume knob for the entire plugin. It is not the same as lowering the key outputs in the key settings of the node. Total Impacts in the Dehancer settings does a better job of reducing the strength of effects like gate weave in a more natural looking way. However, if you plan on using this slider and have used Dehancer inbuilt color space transform, it will change the image like this, which we don't want. So you can do the following. Create a second node before the current by pressing Shift S. Copy-paste Dehancer plugin with Command C, Command V, or Control C, Control V if you're on Windows. Now in the options of the newly created node, disable all tools, and back at the original node, reset all the input settings. Now you can safely change the output value in the total impact setting of the second node without affecting the color space transform. Final step is to switch the quality setting in options menu to high for rendering. And that's it. Now let's check out what Dehancer mobile app is capable of. The Dehancer mobile app brings the power of film emulation to your iOS devices. It offers a simplified interface with a variety of presets and customization options. And right off the bat, it has much better previews compared to DaVinci Resolve plugin with literally no previews for all the film presets. Okay, so where the mobile app really shines is in its interface, and honestly just how easy it is to use. I already mentioned much better previews, but there's a lot more going on. Aside from just film presets, the Dehancer mobile app gives you full look presets. Those include film and print film stocks, color head and expand adjustments, film grain, halation, bloom, and vignette all dialed in for you. You can favorite a preset with a quick double tap or a long press and selecting a corresponding option. And of course, if you want complete control over every setting, you can select a preset or start from scratch, jump to the Edit tab here on top, and dive into each setting menu at the bottom. The only thing that takes a bit of getting used to is that tapping on a setting group activates it right away. So if you are looking for, say, contrast and you tap on compression, but that setting is not there, this group is now active and you have to turn it off before you can keep searching. No big deal once you know where everything is though. After you've customized the presets, you can go back to the Presets tab, click Save at the bottom, and reuse that newly created preset later with a single tap. Holding your finger on a viewer toggles between before and after. You've got Undo and Redo buttons in the top right, along with the histogram toggle. The Export button is right underneath that, and I really appreciate the simplicity and functionality here. You can easily select the resolution, bitrate, and frame rate for your exported video. Performance-wise, I haven't run into any issues or lags. I'm using an M2 iPad Pro, and a 1-minute video with a standard preset exports in about 3.5 minutes. This timer here sometimes can be a little bit misleading. Should I add all the extra effects like gate weave and film damage? This time goes up to nearly 5 minutes for a 1-minute video clip export. Now let's talk about differences between the plugin and the standalone app. Pricing is the most obvious one. The mobile app doesn't have a lifetime license, but the annual option is more than 3 times cheaper than the plugin. Plus, you can go for a monthly subscription. Functionally, the mobile app is incredibly similar to the full plugin, but there are a few limitations on iOS. First, it seems you can't grade raw footage. The app only imports photos and videos from the Apple photo library, which doesn't support file extensions like .r3d or .braw. Luckily, raw photos are supported. I've used it both with .dngs and .arw files without any issues. However, photo export is limited to JPEGs. The LUT generator is missing on mobile, though you can share presets that are limited to the Dehancer app. In Dehancer mobile app, there's no false color monitoring, and there's no quick way to turn off all settings except for resetting them. Here are a few other minor differences I've noticed. The clipping indication toggle isn't in the mobile app, but it turns on automatically when you open the histogram. In the mobile app, films are grouped for easier selection and you can pick favorites. In iOS Dehancer version, there's no Cineon film log option in the print profiles. There's also no mask mode for the vignette, but you can set the feather to 0 for a mask preview. The mobile app has a period jitter toggle in the custom film damage profile, which, oddly enough, is absent in the desktop plugin. And the mobile app has an inbuilt crop tool. Otherwise, all the tools and settings are pretty much the same. If you found this video useful, hit the like button and consider subscribing for more DaVinci Resolve content.